Mark tagged you in 18 new photos. The Facebook notification popped up on my phone screen while I was chopping celery for a pot roast. I didn't think much of it at first. Mark was an old logistics client of my husband, Ryan. I thought it was just a leftover album from a company dinner. I tapped the screen with a damp thumb. The first image loaded. My husband was sitting in an armchair I didn't recognize. He was cradling two newborn infants in his arms. His face was flushed with a soft, proud smile I hadn't seen in years. Right behind him, my younger sister, Hannah, was leaning down. Her chin rested naturally on his shoulder. The caption beneath it read, "The twins are finally 1 month old." I pulled up a stool and sat down. Before I tell you how a single click ended my 8-year marriage, please take a moment to comment below with where you are watching from and what time it is right now. The house was completely quiet except for the steady thrum of the dryer in the hallway. The smell of rosemary and browning meat filled the kitchen. Everything looked normal. But my ears started buzzing. I scrolled down to the comments section. "Congratulations, Dad! They have your eyes. Ryan!" Dozens of names from our church group and Ryan's office were leaving heart emojis. Nobody was hiding anything. Mark had tagged me simply because he assumed I was already part of the celebration. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the knife. I zoomed in on the second baby's left wrist. A tiny silver chain caught the light of the camera flash. It was the exact silver bracelet with the engraved clover charm that I bought for Hannah's 35th birthday last November. My name is Claire Bennett. I am an internal auditor, and I just found the first discrepancy in my own life. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2:00 a.m. The house was cold. The kind of damp autumn chill that creeps through the floorboards of an old suburban home. I sat in my home office, the only illumination coming from the harsh blue glow of my corporate laptop. On the left side of my desk sat my medical binder, full of faded receipts from our fertility clinic and color-coded schedules of my hormone injections. On the right side, a glass of water I hadn't touched since midnight. In my line of work as an internal auditor, emotion is an anomaly. If a ledger doesn't balance, you don't cry. You look for the variance. I logged into the corporate VPN using the administrative credentials I still held for Ryan's logistics firm. My fingers were steady on the keyboard, typing the commands to pull the shared Outlook calendar archives from the past 3 years. I started cross-referencing dates. October 14th, 2 years ago. According to my medical logs, that was the Thursday I spent 4 hours in the recovery room after my second embryo transfer failed. I had driven myself home because Ryan texted me that he was stranded at a freight terminal in Toledo, Ohio. I found the calendar entry on the server. There was a recurring private invite labeled Regional Site Audit. But the metadata on the calendar file showed the invite was created from an IP address registered to a boutique hotel downtown, just 10 minutes from our house. I checked another date, March 3rd of last year, the day of my third hormone harvest, when my abdomen was so swollen from injections that I could barely hook my slacks. Ryan's calendar marked him as out of office, client golf tournament. The corporate toll tag records for his company Mercedes told a different story. The car had crossed the bridge toward Hannah's neighborhood at 8:15 a.m. and didn't return until the following evening. The numbers were aligning, but not for a business model. They were mapping out a sequence of abandonment. I opened the company's general ledger next, running a variance analysis on the accounts payable. A specific recurring line item caught my eye under account 6,200, outside professional services. A vendor named Brooks Creative Solutions had been receiving a monthly retainer of $4,500 for 36 months. The invoices were vague, using generic corporate jargon like logistics optimization consultation and streamlining support. Every single check was authorized electronically by Ryan's private digital signature token. There were no corresponding deliverables attached to the files, no slide decks, no reports, no meeting minutes. Hannah had a degree in art history and had been unemployed since the pandemic. She didn't know the first thing about supply chain optimization. My husband wasn't just hiding an affair. He was using the company's operational budget to fund it. I plugged a secure flash drive into the USB port. The click of the plastic housing felt loud in the dark room. I began downloading the PDF copies of the cleared checks, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. The final invoice in the folder was dated just last week. It included a reimbursement request for a $1,200 charge at St. Mary's maternity ward. The corporate account had paid for the delivery of the twins. The aroma of burnt espresso and damp wool hung heavy inside the small brick coffee shop on East Main Street. Outside, the Richmond rain sleeted against the narrow windows, blurring the yellow headlights of traffic crawling down the avenue. I kept my hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee, using the heat to stop my fingers from shaking. Across the small oak table sat Daniel Carter, a domestic relations attorney known for his lack of theatricality. He opened a manila folder, his thumb flicking through several notarized real estate agreements and employment contracts. "Your husband hired her exactly 3 years ago, Claire," Daniel said, his voice dropping below the hum of the espresso machine. Her official title on the payroll was executive assistant, but her salary structure didn't match the administrative grid. I looked at the copy of Hannah's W-2 form inside the folder. 3 years. That was the exact winter my mother had called me, crying because Hannah couldn't make her car payment again. I had given Hannah $3,000, telling her to take her time paying it back. All the while, she was already sitting in Ryan's passenger seat, listening to him complain about me. Daniel pulled out a set of translated email transcripts from Ryan's private corporate server. "It wasn't just a physical arrangement at first," Daniel murmured, adjusting his glasses. "Your husband spent the first 6 months playing the martyr." I read the lines Ryan had typed to my sister on his corporate laptop during his late-night shifts. "Claire is distant," he had written. "Everything in our house is sterile now. Every conversation is just syringes, ovulation charts, and clinical appointments. I feel like an asset, not a man." The words felt like a physical weight pressing against my ribs. I had been enduring invasive procedures, waking up at 5 o'clock a.m. to drive to the fertility clinic, and hiding my bruised abdomen under loose sweaters. I did it for us. But to Ryan, my agony was just an inconvenience that justified his drift, and Hannah had listened, absorbing his resentment, using it to feed an old, dark hunger she had carried since childhood. Growing up, Hannah was always the sister who arrived late, the one who left her room in shambles, the one whose report cards were hidden under the kitchen magnets. I was the one who graduated top of the class, the one who bought the brick house, the one our parents praised at Thanksgiving dinners. Hannah didn't just want a man, she wanted my life. She wanted the version of Ryan that belonged to the successful, stable sister. Daniel turned another page in the file, sliding a certified residential lease toward me. "This is the secondary variance," he said, tapping a line on the document. "She isn't living in her old apartment anymore." The lease was for a 2-bedroom luxury condominium in the Riverfront district, complete with a concierge and private parking. The lessee listed on the legal document was the corporate entity of Ryan's logistics firm. It was funded under the guise of an executive relocation suite. I looked at the address. The building was exactly 4 blocks from my own corporate office building. For 2 years, while I was taking my lunch breaks at the bakery downstairs, my sister was living in an apartment paid for by my household's joint business interests. She was buying groceries at the same market, walking the same sidewalks, carrying my husband's child, and living less than 10 minutes away from my desk. She had effectively built a duplicate life, using my resources, right in my blind spot. "Do you want to confront them?" Daniel asked, his pen hovering over a draft of the divorce petition. I looked down at the coffee mug, the dark liquid perfectly still. The urge to scream had passed hours ago, replaced by a cold, operational necessity. "No," I said. my voice sounding flat and clean in the quiet shop. An audit is never successful if you alert the subject before the records are secured. The medicine cabinet in our master bathroom was always organized with a precision that bordered on madness. Row after row of brown glass prescription bottles, sterile saline wipes, and clear plastic boxes of disposable syringes occupied the top two shelves. I sat on the cold porcelain edge of the bathtub, my fingers tracing a dull, yellowish-purple bruise on the left side of my abdomen. It was the physical mark left by my final progesterone injection, a shot I had administered myself 3 weeks ago while standing in front of this very mirror. For 8 years. My body had been a construction site of failed expectations. Every negative pregnancy test was a verdict, a silent declaration that I was the broken component in our household. I remembered the quiet, agonizing drive back from the clinic after our third failed embryo implantation. I had sat in the driveway for 40 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, whispering apologies to a husband who wasn't even home to hear them. I blamed my long hours at the firm. I blamed the coffee I drank in college. I blamed the genetic makeup my parents had passed down to me. I had lived inside a self-constructed prison of guilt, adjusting my life, my diet, and my sanity to fix a deficiency I assumed was entirely mine. The front door downstairs opened, its heavy wooden frame clicking shut against the jamb. Ryan's footsteps crossed the hardwood floor of the foyer, measured and casual, the stride of a man returning from a routine business trip. "Claire?" he called out, his voice echoing up the stairwell. I let my linen blouse fall back over my stomach, covering the Tim, and walked down the stairs. He was standing by the kitchen island, still wearing his charcoal overcoat, holding a massive bundle of white roses. The paper wrapping crinkled as he extended them toward me with a soft, sympathetic smile. "I know things have been incredibly tense lately. Birthday girl," he murmured, his voice laced with that smooth, deliberate warmth he used during client presentations. I looked at the white petals. They were pristine, expensive, and completely devoid of scent. "Thank you, Ryan," I said, my voice matching the flat neutrality of the kitchen tiles. I took the vase from the cabinet under the sink, turned on the faucet, and watched the cold water fill the glass. He loosened his silk tie, tossing his keys into the ceramic bowl by the microwave. "I just wish you could let some of the stress go, Claire," he continued, leaning against the granite counter, watching me arrange the stems. "Every time I walk into this house, it feels like a waiting room. All we talk about are hormone levels, clinical appointments, and what the specialists say. It's killing the atmosphere here. It feels like you're so obsessed with having a baby that you've forgotten how to just be my wife." He delivered the sentences with a practiced sigh, his eyes steady, projecting the exhaustion of a patient husband dealing with an unstable partner. It was the exact script he had used for the last 2 years, a masterclass in emotional erosion. He was rewriting my physical suffering into a personal defect, making my grief the weapon that drove him away. If I hadn't opened Facebook yesterday, I would have apologized. I would have stepped forward, wrapped my arms around his neck, and promised to try harder, just like I always did. Instead, I trimmed the last rose stem with the kitchen shears, the blades cutting through the green wood with a clean, sharp snap. "You're right," I said, offering him a small, polite smile as I placed the vase in the center of the table. "I need to focus on what we actually have." He nodded, looking relieved that his performance had cleared the air so quickly. He turned toward the living room to hang up his coat, confident that his narrative remained secure. I reached into the right pocket of my cardigan, my fingers brushing against a slip of thermal paper I had retrieved from his car's glove box that morning. It was a merchant copy of a Visa receipt from a high-end baby boutique in Charlottesville. Authorized 2 days ago, the item description was printed clearly near the bottom. Upa Baby Vista 5, 2 double stroller, and bassinet combo. The total was $3,200, charged directly to our joint household contingency account. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the television hum from the next room, my hand resting flat against the paper in my pocket. The white roses sat on the table between us, a beautiful cover for a ledger that was bleeding out in secret. The Palm Court tea room at the Jefferson Hotel was suffocatingly quiet. The silence broken only by the delicate clinking of silver spoons against porcelain cups. Sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass ceiling, casting amber and green patterns over the crisp white linen tablecloth between us. My mother-in-law, Margaret Bennett, sat perfectly upright in her tailored navy wool blazer, her silver hair pinned back with a severe pearl brooch. She had always been a woman of absolute decorum, the kind who measured her life by social graces and the reputation of her family name. But today, her hands were trembling so badly she had to set her teacup down before the porcelain rattled against the saucer. "I asked you here because I couldn't look you in the eye in your own kitchen." "Claire," Margaret said, her voice dropping into a thin, fragile whisper. She didn't wait for me to reply. Instead, she opened her leather handbag with stiff fingers and pulled out a long, legal-sized envelope. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, and bore the faded blue watermark of the Richmond Fertility Center, dated exactly 8 years ago. She slid the envelope across the linen table, her palm lingering on it for a second, as if she were giving away a piece of her soul. "You need to open it," she murmured, looking down at her neatly folded cloth napkin. I picked up the envelope, the old paper rough against my fingertips. Inside was a single laboratory report, signed by Dr. Rebecca Collins, detailing a comprehensive semen analysis under Ryan's name. As an auditor, my eyes skipped the technical jargon and went straight to the final diagnostic summary at the bottom of the page. Diagnosis: severe OAT syndrome, male factor infertility permanent. Probability of natural conception, 0%. The text didn't blur. It stood out in sharp, clinical black ink. 8 years ago, this analysis was completed 3 months before our very first intrauterine insemination cycle. Imagine spending nearly a decade letting a woman mutilate her own health with daily hormone injections, enduring 3 devastating miscarriages, and crying herself to sleep, all while knowing your own son was the reason she couldn't conceive. If you think a mother who conceals this kind of medical truth to protect a man's ego while destroying an innocent woman's life deserves to be exposed, please hit the like button right now. The tea room seemed to fade into a dull gray haze, the gentle hum of the harpist in the lobby sounding miles away. The clinic couriered the results to our old address on Grove Avenue by mistake, Margaret whispered, her eyes still fixed on the table. Ryan had already moved out into your townhouse, but the paperwork came to my mailbox, and I opened it without thinking. She finally looked up, her dark eyes swimming with a mixture of old fear and pathetic regret. He was so proud. Claire. He was my boy, and his business was just beginning to take off. I knew what a diagnosis like this would do to his confidence. I knew his pride would be utterly ruined if he found out he couldn't pass on the Bennett name. "So you hid it," I said, my voice cutting through her excuses like a scalpel, flat and entirely devoid of inflection. "I called Dr. Collins," Margaret pleaded, reaching across the table to touch my wrist, but I pulled my arm back before her fingers could make contact. I begged her as a mother to let me handle the revelation in my own time. I told her Ryan was in a delicate psychological state, and she agreed to let me keep the file until we were ready. But the right time never came. Years passed, and I watched you take the blame. I watched you go through those awful surgeries. I told myself that if the IVF eventually worked, the secret wouldn't matter anymore. I stared at the woman sitting across from me, looking past her pearls and her expensive wool jacket. I felt a cold, leaden detachment settling deep inside my chest. A complete evaporation of the woman who had spent 8 years trying to please this family. "You sat at my dining table every Thanksgiving, Margaret," I said, my voice steady, conversational, and lethal. You watched me refuse wine because I was on a treatment cycle. You watched my hands shake from the hormone drops. You even told me once that perhaps I was working too hard at my firm, suggesting that my ambition was keeping us from having a child. Margaret covered her face with her trembling hands, a small, choked sob escaping her throat. I am so sorry. Claire, I am so deeply sorry. When I saw that digital album yesterday, when I saw Ryan holding those two babies and Emily smiling next to him, the blood left my face. She wept. Using my sister's old childhood name, I realized my silence didn't protect him at all. It just gave him the arrogance to destroy your marriage over a child that cannot possibly belong to him. I didn't offer her a tissue. I didn't comfort her. I simply folded the yellowed medical report, slipped it into my leather portfolio, and zipped the brass fastener closed. The invoice for the stroller was $3,200. Margaret, I said, rising from the chair and smoothing the front of my slacks. Your son used our joint account to pay for it. I think that's a variance your family ledger can no longer afford to hide. The windshield wipers of my Lexus beat a furious, rhythmic cadence against the glass. But the torrential Virginia rain was winning, blurring the neon sign of the pharmacy across the asphalt into a watery smear. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling low, the car smelling faintly of the wet leather from my handbag and the cold, damp air slipping through the door seals. The legal portfolio sat heavy on my lap, its zipper cold against my wrists as I unfastened it and pulled out the yellowed lab report Margaret had carried in her purse for 8 years. I snapped on the overhead map light, flooding the cabin with a clinical white glare that chased away the shadows of the parking lot. My eyes didn't drift to the emotional weight of what my mother-in-law had just confessed. Instead, my brain automatically shifted back into its professional wiring, processing the medical data the exact same way I analyzed a fraudulent balance sheet at my manufacturing firm. I stared at the specific parameter. Sperm count, 0. Morphology, not applicable. Motility, 0. The clinical conclusion was unequivocal, a permanent structural deficit that time could not alter. Then I did the math. 8 years of total, absolute infertility. No medical treatments had ever been sought by Ryan, because he had spent those 8 years believing his reproductive health was pristine, while I absorbed the needles and the shame. Hannah had been working as his executive assistant for exactly 36 months. The twins were born exactly 4 weeks ago. If Ryan's biological probability of natural conception was 0, then a miracle had not occurred in that luxury riverfront condominium 4 blocks from my office. A cold, visceral chill traveled down my spine, settling deep in my gut like ice water. Ryan wasn't just a cheating husband who had stepped across the boundary of his marriage to build a secret family with my sister. He was an idiot who was being hollowed out by a secondary deception, the twins he was proudly cradling in that Facebook album, the infants whose hospital bills were currently draining our corporate operating account. Could not biologically carry his name. Hannah had handed him a fraudulent ledger, and he had signed it without checking the documentation. I reached for my phone, my fingers tapping the screen to bring up my old contacts from our active IVF years. I dialed the direct line for Dr. Rebecca Collins's private office, skipping the main clinic reception entirely. The line rang 3 times before her assistant answered, her voice polished and guarded. "This is Claire Bennett," I said, my tone flat, steady, and stripped of any urgency. "I need to speak with Dr. Collins immediately regarding a historical verification on an account archive." There was a brief hesitation, the sound of keys clacking over the line, before the call clicked over to Dr. Collins' private office line. "Claire." "Doctor," Collins said, her voice dropping into that careful, muted register she used when a patient's world was tilting. "Margaret told me she was meeting you today. I am so deeply sorry for my silence." "I don't need an apology, Dr. Collins," I said, leaning my head back against the headrest, watching the rain stream down the side window in transparent rivulets. I need a clinical confirmation. The male factor diagnosis from 8 years ago, OOAT syndrome with zero baseline motility. Is there any documented percentage of spontaneous reversal after nearly a decade without surgical intervention? Silence stretched over the cellular connection, heavy and absolute, save for the dull hum of the hospital heating vents in her background. No, Claire. Doctor, Colin said quietly, her words measured and absolute. In Ryan's specific case, the blockage and genetic parameters were definitive. Spontaneous regeneration is a statistical impossibility. If there are children, they are either the product of a donor cycle he never disclosed to you, or they belong to someone else. I finished the sentence for her, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Yes, the doctor whispered. Thank you, I said, and ended the call before she could offer any more clinical sympathy. I dropped the phone into the cup holder, its screen going black. I sat in the dark car for 5 minutes, listening to the monotonous slap of the wiper blades against the glass. Hannah had spent her whole life wanting to conquer my territory, to step into the shoes of the sister who had always run ahead of her. She had taken my husband. She had taken my joint funds. And she had built a counterfeit kingdom less than 10 minutes from my desk. But she had built it on quicksand. She had lied to Ryan to trap him. Or she was so deeply entangled in her own chaotic choices that she didn't even know who the real father was. Either way, the ledger was fraudulent from top to bottom. I clicked off the map light, put the Lexus into drive, and pulled out into the rain-slicked Richmond traffic. The audit wasn't over. I had just uncovered the second line of liability, and the final reckoning was going to destroy every single asset they thought they owned. The grandfather clock in Margaret's mahogany-paneled foyer ticked with an oppressive, metallic echo. The air inside the house smelled of old silver polish, lavender sachet, and the heavy dampness bleeding in from the autumn storm outside. I stood perfectly still in the dim, unlit hallway, my shoulder pressed against the floral wallpaper, watching the scene unfold through the 3-inch gap of the double parlor doors. From my position in the shadows, I had a clear line of sight to the velvet sofa where Ryan and Hannah were seated side by side. Hannah looked exhausted, her hair pinned back hastily, but there was an undeniable, smug aura of ownership in the way her hand rested casually on Ryan's thigh. Between them sat the double infant car seat, where the twins were sleeping beneath a thick flannel blanket. Ryan was leaning back, swirling a glass of scotch Margaret had poured for him, completely oblivious to the ledger that had already been audited behind his back. Margaret stood near the fireplace, her silhouette stiff and unyielding in her navy wool suit. Without saying a single introductory word, she reached into her pocket, pulled out the worn, yellowed envelope from the fertility clinic, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table. The paper landed with a dull slap right next to Ryan's car keys. "Open it, Ryan," Margaret said, her voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register that made the ice in his glass stop clinking. Ryan blinked, offering a brief, dismissive chuckle as he set his drink down. "What is this, Mom? A savings bond for the kids?" he asked, stretching his hand out toward the envelope with the easy, arrogant confidence of a man who believed he ran every room he entered. But beside him, Hannah went perfectly rigid. I watched her eyes lock onto the faded blue watermark of the Richmond Fertility Center on the outside of the envelope. The blood instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin looking like wet chalk. Her fingers shifted from Ryan's leg, her nails digging so hard into the plastic handle of the infant Noi that her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Ryan pulled the medical report from the envelope, his eyes skimming the clinical black ink, his brow furrowing as he tried to decode the parameters. "This is old," he said, shifting his weight, a forced smile cracking the corners of his mouth. "It's from our first year of IVF. Why do you have Claire's old test results in your house, Mom?" He let out another short laugh, looking up at Margaret, expecting her to join in on what he assumed was a bizarre misunderstanding. "Look at the name on the registration block. Ryan," Margaret said, her voice completely devoid of maternal softness. Ryan's eyes dropped back to the page. I watched the exact second the clinical summary registered in his brain. Male factor infertility permanent. Spontaneous regeneration. Statistical impossibility. The glass of scotch on the table was forgotten as the paper began to tremble between his fingers. This says I'm the one," Ryan stammered, his polished, executive voice cracking into something small and hollow. "This says I can't have—" He turned his head slowly toward Hannah, his jaw tightening into a hard, defensive knot. Hannah didn't look at him. Her eyes were glued to the glass table, her mouth pressed into a thin, terrified line as she pulled the infant blanket higher over the twins. "I intercepted that mail 8 years ago because I wanted to save your pride, Ryan," Margaret announced, her chest rising and falling beneath her jacket as she took a step closer to the table. "I let Claire carry the guilt. I let her mutilate her body with drugs. And I stayed silent because I thought it was a mother's duty to protect her son's dignity." Margaret paused, her dark eyes flashing with absolute disgust as she pointed a manicured finger directly at my sister. "But you," Margaret whispered, the venom in her tone cutting through the quiet room. "You allowed this man to destroy his 8-year marriage. You let him steal from his company accounts to buy you a luxury condominium. And you brought these 2 babies into my family house, pretending they carry the Bennett name." Margaret leaned over the table, her face inches from Hannah's. "I hid that report because I loved my son. But you are sitting in my parlor, trying to scenic this entire family with a completely different line of douilatre." Ryan stood up so fast his knee caught the edge of the glass table, causing his scotch glass to tilt and spill the amber liquid onto the yellowed medical paper. The storm outside rattled the window panes, but the silence inside the parlor was absolute, a heavy, suffocating ceiling that was about to collapse on all of them. In the darkness of the hallway, I let out a slow, silent breath, my fingers resting flat against the wall as the first wall of their counterfeit kingdom began to crumble. The fluorescent lights in Daniel Carter's conference room hummed with a sterile, unchanging intensity. The room smelled of laser toner, commercial carpet cleaner, and the bitter dregs of a pot of coffee that had been heating since 9 o'clock a.m. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, my hands folded loosely on top of my legal pad, my expression completely neutral. To my right sat Daniel Carter, his fountain pen resting beside a stack of sealed, white overnight courier envelopes. Across from us sat Ryan, his suit jacket wrinkled, his tie loosened by 2 inches, and his eyes bloodshot from a fortnight of sleeplessness. Hannah sat in the corner chair, pushed back slightly from the table as if trying to shrink into the drywall, her eyes darting between the sealed envelopes and the frosted glass door. Margaret sat between them, a pillar of rigid, unyielding navy wool, her jaw set so tight the muscles in her throat looked strained. No one spoke. The only sound was the muffled rumble of a delivery truck shifting gears on the street below. Daniel Carter picked up a pair of metal scissors, slit the top of the first envelope with a clean, slicing hiss, and pulled out the legal documentation from the genetic laboratory. He didn't read the preliminary paragraphs. He slid the final page directly across the polished wood toward Ryan. "The results from the buccal swabs are definitive, Ryan," Daniel said, his professional voice striking the quiet room like a gavel. Ryan's hand shook as he pulled the paper towards himself, his thumb smudging the crisp white margin. I watched his eyes lock onto the bold, capitalized line at the bottom of the column. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. He stared at the number for 10 seconds, his chest hitching once, twice, like an engine running out of fuel. "0?" he whispered, the single word falling flat against the mahogany table. It's 0. He turned his head toward Hannah, his face contorting into an expression of raw, unmitigated humiliation as the entire foundation of his 3-year affair vanished into clinical ink. "You told me they were mine, Hannah," Ryan muttered, his voice rising from a hollow whisper into a rough, jagged edge. "You sat in that hospital room, you watched me sign the birth certificates, and you told me I was a father." Hannah covered her mouth, a small, defensive sob escaping her lips as she pressed herself further back into her chair. "We had an argument. Ryan," she cried, her voice thin and desperate as she finally looked up, her face a pale canvas of exposed lies. "It was last October, during your 3-week logistics conference in Chicago, when you wouldn't answer my calls." She looked at me for a split second, her eyes full of an old, pathetic malice that had finally turned inward. "I was angry," Hannah continued, turning back to Ryan, the words spilling out in a chaotic rush. "I went to the hotel lounge down the street from the convention center. I met a man, a managing director for an investment fund from New York. It was only one night, Ryan, just one night because I felt completely abandoned by you." The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy weight that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "When I found out I was pregnant a month later, the dates were so close." She wept, her fingers twisting her purse strap until the leather groaned. "I didn't do the testing. I didn't think I needed to. I wanted to believe they were yours, Ryan. I wanted us to be a real family so Claire would finally see that someone chose me over her." Ryan looked down at his trembling hands, the realization of his absolute irrelevance settling deep into his shoulders. He had destroyed an 8-year marriage, embezzled corporate funds to maintain a luxury condominium, and alienated his own mother, all to serve as the convenient financial custodian for another man's children. He had traded his entire reputation for a duplicate life that was a complete fabrication. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my pen and drew a single, clean black line through Ryan's name on my ledger of assets. The audit was nearly complete, and the liability was entirely theirs. The grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club was a sea of black tuxedos, silk evening gowns, and the expensive clinking of champagne flutes. The air smelled of roasted prime rib, floral centerpieces, and the damp autumn wind rustling the heavy velvet curtains near the terrace. It was the 30-year anniversary of the logistics company Ryan had spent his adult life building, and he had orchestrated the entire evening to serve as his personal stage. He wanted a public transition, a smooth, elegant narrative shift from the sterile, childless marriage he was leaving behind to the fertile new family he had built with my sister. Hannah sat at the head table under the glittering crystal chandeliers, wearing a deep burgundy dress that didn't quite hide the pale, trembling look on her face after our morning in the lawyer's office. Ryan stepped onto the raised wooden podium, tapping the microphone with a manicured thumb, his handsome face radiating the effortless, hollow confidence of a man who believed his own lies. 30 years of logistical excellence, he began, his voice warm and deep through the surround sound speakers. But a company cannot grow without the courage to step into new chapters, to embrace brave changes with absolute honesty. He paused, offering a significant, rehearsed glance toward Hannah, waiting for the polite murmur of approval from his board of directors and local investors. I stood up from table 9. The heavy oak chair legs scraped sharply against the polished hardwood floor, the sudden sound cutting through his sentence. If you can already feel the cold, heavy hand of justice about to drop on a man who uses a corporate podium to romanticize his own betrayal, please comment with the word truth right now. I walked down the center aisle, my black dress shifting softly around my ankles, my movements measured and entirely devoid of hurry. Ryan paused, his smile freezing for a microsecond before his executive mask slid back into place. "Claire, this is a private matter," he murmured under his breath as I reached the stage, trying to project the image of a concerned husband dealing with an emotional woman. "I am not emotional," "Ryan," I said, my voice carrying clearly into the microphone as I reached out my hand and took it from his grip. "Tonight, I am simply conducting an audit." I didn't scream. I didn't look at my sister. I pulled a small wireless remote control from my clutch and clicked the master button. The massive projector screen behind the podium, which had been displaying a slideshow of company freight trucks, instantly shifted to a stark, high-contrast PDF document. It was a spreadsheet mapping out 3 years of unauthorized corporate transfers to Brooks Creative Solutions, totaling over $160,000 of embezzled operating capital. A sharp gasp rippled through the front row where his chief financial officer sat, a wine glass knocking against a silver butter knife with a high-pitched ring. "This is financial optimization. Claire," Ryan stammered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the wood podium. "No, Ryan, that is a felony," I said, my voice striking the dead silence of the room with a cold, clinical finality. I clicked the remote a second time. The ledger disappeared, replaced by the genetic laboratory report from Daniel Carter's office. The bold line, "Probability of paternity, 0.00%, magnified to 6 feet high on the ballroom wall. The silence in the room became absolute, a suffocating ceiling where no one dared to breathe. Ryan stood beneath the white glare of his own medical reality, his face turning the color of old paper before the very investors who held his company's debt. His executive vice president stood up slowly from his seat, staring at the screen, then at Ryan. With an expression of unmitigated disgust, the mask of the proud, successful businessman didn't just crack, it vanished entirely, leaving a small, hollow man exposed under the country club spotlights. I left the microphone on the stand, turned my back on the stage, and walked out of the ballroom without looking behind me, the sound of the first hurried whispers beginning to rise like smoke from the ruins of his kingdom. The rain had slowed to a freezing drizzle by the time I returned to the brick house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The interior was dark, smelling faintly of the lemon cleaner I had used on the counters before leaving for the country club. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I left my leather clutch on the foyer table and walked into the kitchen to brew a mug of chamomile tea. The quiet was heavy, a stark contrast to the chaotic murmurs that had filled the country club ballroom just an hour ago. A sudden, erratic pounding rattled the wood of the front door, followed by a low, broken moan that sounded barely human. I didn't rush. I turned off the kettle, walked slowly to the entryway, and pulled back the heavy curtain beside the door. Ryan was collapsed on his knees on the concrete porch, his tailored tuxedo soaked through, his wet hair plastered against his forehead, and his shoulders heaving with ragged, desperate sobs. I opened the door just wide enough to look down at him, keeping the heavy brass security latch firmly in place. The cold night air rushed over my face, carrying the bitter scent of wet pavement and the cheap bourbon he had likely consumed in his car. "Claire, please," he gasped, his fingers clawing at the wooden threshold as he looked up with bloodshot, swollen eyes. "You have to listen to me. I was completely blind. I didn't know anything about the medical files or what Hannah did in Chicago. My mother ruined my life 8 years ago by hiding that laboratory envelope. Hannah targeted me because she knew I was vulnerable, because she wanted to steal everything we spent nearly a decade building." He wiped his nose with the back of his wet sleeve, his executive posture completely gone, replaced by the pathetic sniveling of a man whose justifications had run out of ground. "I am the victim here. Claire," he cried, his voice cracking against the steady patter of the rain. "I was too walked in my right to be a father by my own family. I was lied to, cheated on, and manipulated into paying for someone else's twins. I never wanted to hurt you. I only strayed because they made me believe my own home was a sterile prison." He reached through the narrow opening of the door, his wet fingers trying to catch the hem of my slacks. "We can fix this. Claire," he begged, his words tumbling out in a desperate, frantic rush. "We know the truth now. The clinic results prove that you never failed me. Your body wasn't the problem, and my mother knows she owes you everything. We can sell the logistics firm, move away from Richmond, and start completely over. Just you and me, the way it was always supposed to be. I looked at him, my hand resting flat against the solid wood of the doorframe. I felt a profound, chilling detachment, a total absence of the anger that had kept me awake at 2 o'clock a.m., staring at spreadsheets. The man kneeling in the rain wasn't mourning the loss of our marriage or the pain he had caused me over 8 years of invasive needles and silent grief. He was mourning the loss of his spotlight, his perfect narrative, and his comfortable luxury condominium. He wanted me to serve as his sanctuary again, to absorb his new humiliation the same way I had absorbed his misplaced blame. "Claire, say something. Please," he whispered, his chest hitching as he stared up into the shadow of the porch light. "Ryan," I said, my voice cutting through his crying. Flat, measured, and entirely free of venom. "No His mouth opened slightly, but no smooth corporate jargon or rehearsed excuse came out. His face simply collapsed into an expression of absolute, hut-hang realization that his words no longer carried any currency. I stepped back into the dry warmth of the foyer and closed the heavy wooden door, shutting out the sight of his soaked tuxedo. I turned the brass thumb turn, and the sound of the new deadbolt locking into the frame echoed through the empty hallway with a dry, clean, and completely final thud. The radiators in my new brick townhouse on Floyd Avenue knocked like old pipes in a classic film, a steady domestic rhythm that no longer signaled chaos. It was mid-April, and the pale spring sunlight filtered through the young sycamore branches outside my second-story window, casting clean, shifting shadows across my small oak writing desk. The space was tight compared to the suburban brick house at the end of the cul-de-sac, but it was honest. There were no organized rows of hormone vials on the bathroom shelves, no corporate calendars mapping out duplicate lives, and no white roses drying into brittle dust on the kitchen counter. I sat in my linen blouse with a mug of black coffee, watching a courier van park along the curb downstairs. Daniel Carter had called me yesterday from his office to confirm that the final decree of dissolution had been entered into the Henrico County court records. The administrative process had taken months of quiet, tedious paperwork, completely devoid of Hollywood theater. But the ledger was finally closed. Ryan's logistics firm had collapsed under the weight of the audit I delivered to his board of directors. The forensic documentation of the $160,000 embezzled through Brooks Creative Solutions forced his business partners to strip him of his voting shares and executive oversight. He had sold his company Mercedes to cover the initial corporate restitution, and the family name he had been so desperate to protect was now just a warning flag in local financial registries. Hannah had packed her 2 oversized suitcases and left Virginia entirely 3 months ago. Once the genetic laboratory report confirmed that the twins didn't share Ryan's biology, the affluent businessman she thought she had conquered turned out to be an unemployed liability. She moved to a small town outside Chicago, unable to sit at our parents' Thanksgiving table or walk down the sidewalks of Richmond without the suffocating weight of family disgrace. A quiet rap sounded at my front door, and when I opened it, Margaret Bennett was standing on the threshold. She wasn't wearing her severe navy wool blazer or her pearl brooch today. She wore a simple gray cardigan, and her silver hair looked softer in the morning light. She didn't ask to come inside, and I didn't invite her. Our boundary now established by months of clean, clinical distance. Without saying a word, she reached into her wool pocket and handed me a certified, sealed document bearing the stamp of her family's trust administration office. "It's a partial transfer deed for the commercial property on East Main Street. Claire," Margaret said, her voice thin but entirely steady. "It belonged to my late husband's estate, and it produces a fixed monthly distribution. I restructured my successor co-trustee filings last week to remove Ryan entirely, and I am transferring this portion directly into your name as a formal, legal restitution for the 8 years of silence I kept from you." I looked down at the document in my hand, the thick paper cold against my fingers. I hadn't requested a single dollar of the Bennett family inheritance during the mediation sessions, choosing to walk away with only the assets I had legally earned at my own firm. "I don't need your money to rebuild my life, Margaret," I said, my voice conversational and flat against the quiet of the hallway. "I know you don't, Claire," Margaret whispered, a small, sad smile touching the corners of her mouth. "That is exactly why it belongs to you. My son used corporate ledgers to buy a counterfeit kingdom, and my own lies funded your suffering. This property isn't a gift. It is a liability that needs to be cleared from my conscience before I can sleep at night." I studied her face for 5 seconds, seeing the genuine exhaustion of an older woman who had finally stopped trying to manage a beautiful lie. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, accepting the paper. She offered a small nod, turned slowly, and walked back down the townhouse stairs, her footsteps light and unhurried. I closed the door, walked back to my desk, and laid the property deed flat beneath the spring sunlight. I didn't feel a surge of triumph, nor did I feel bitterness. I felt only a deep, spacious lightness, the clean sensation of a room that had finally been emptied of ghosts. The Bennett family asset was mine now, but I already knew I wouldn't be using it to buy silk gowns or vacation rentals. The numbers on that deed were going to serve as the initial operating capital for a project Ryan and Hannah would never be allowed to touch. And for the first time in nearly a decade, my future belonged entirely to me. The smell of fresh white paint and clean maplewood furniture filled the bright, sunny room on East Main Street. It was the formal opening day of the Transparency in Fertility Support Foundation. Through the large glass windows, the morning traffic of Richmond hummed softly, a gentle reminder that life moves forward. 6 couples sat in the reception area, their hands clasped tightly together over folders of medical histories. A senior administrative assistant was guiding them through the new legal forms, showing them how to demand direct digital access to their laboratory archives without relying on a middleman. The commercial property Margaret had transferred to me was no longer a monument to a family's disgrace. It had been audited, cleared, and repurposed into a sanctuary for the truth. I watched a young woman in a loose sweater look up from her paperwork, her shoulders dropping as she realized she was finally allowed to see her own record. I knew that exact weight. I had spent 8 years carrying a structural failure that belonged to someone else's biology, believing my own body was the defect in our home. But looking at the clean, white walls of this office, I realized something that no court order or bank balance could ever measure. The ending of my marriage was never about a digital album, an embezzlement scheme, or a secret buried in a mother's safe. It was about the exact microsecond I stopped waiting for a liar to hand me my worth and went out to find the facts myself. If this story touched you in any way, I want you to look closely at your own life. Have you ever had to carry a blame that was never yours to carry? Have you stayed silent in a room full of people because you were too busy trying to fix a relationship built on hidden ledgers? Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from tonight. We share these journeys every single day because our generation understands that a beautiful lie is never worth the price of your peace. If you want to continue finding strength in these moments of justice, please subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss our daily releases. Take a long look around the screen before you go, and click on one of our other video recommendations to see more incredible reckonings. In our very next video, we will be diving into another profound family mystery involving a hidden inheritance and a sister who thought she could overwrite a sibling's identity. You won't want to miss how the paperwork foibade the truth in that case, so make sure your notifications are turned on. I stood by the window as the first appointment of the morning was called into the consultation office. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool spring air, feeling the final traces of the old house leave my lungs entirely. Until next time, take care of yourself, Stay vigilant with your documentation. And remember that your dignity is always worth protecting.